Hey guys, another One Take review, and today I wanted to talk about what many consider to be the final proper Joy Division album, Closer. Closer was released just a mere year after the legendary Unknown Pleasures, an album that's probably sold just as many, if not more, t-shirts than it has actual copies over the years. However, the band's first posthumous effort after that album probably reaches higher levels of existentialism than its much more famous and beloved predecessor. There's a deep sense of melancholy and nihilism that's woven into Closer that really only a couple tracks at most on Unknown Pleasures ever reached. Even more intense is just how uncomfortable listening to Closer can actually be. This is obviously affected by the circumstances surrounding the suicide of frontman Ian Curtis, and even though it is obviously a depressing story, it is a very famous story that even people who don't listen to Joy Division know, so it might be a softened emotional blow to newer listeners, even if they aren't totally familiar with the band's sound. A lot of people know Curtis's life story. Nonetheless, that doesn't make this album any less emotionally bleak or devastating. I mean, this is, as horrible as it is to say, basically a suicide note with music backing it. Themes of self-isolation, existence, alienation, and finally death are all explored throughout Closer before the absolutely gut-wrenching closer that is Decades, which is a brutal song and caps off not only the record, not only the classic period of Joy Division's career, but also, at least to some extent, the very life of Ian Curtis. Moving on, I will say that I do feel guilty only bringing up Ian Curtis and regarding his suicide and his death, because he truly was an absolutely magical performer, but it was in the strangest of ways. He feels incredibly distant and cold and almost not there throughout Closer, but it kind of makes it work even better than it would with someone a little more directly engaging. Throughout this record, Ian Curtis, in his personality, it almost feels like he's some sort of wounded hero in some overdramatic fantasy film as he dramatically stands on top of a hill before turning his back on his comrades and companions that have been with him over the past hour and a half or the past 25 episodes or whatever, but that's where the brutality of it all kicks in because it isn't fake, it's real, it's not fantasy. Ian Curtis doesn't return to slay the dragon to the delight of nearby villages, he just leaves. Ultimately, he ended up joining the land of incredible talents in music that have left us just much too soon and with much too little work. And the fact that he leaves behind with him the devastatingly cold performances on tracks like The Eternal here makes his passing all the more difficult to really accept, even all these years later. Moving on from Curtis himself, let me discuss the overall composition of this record. Repetition is a major concept that heavily defines Closer and its overall sound and its overall soundscapes. Songs like 24 Hours have basic motifs that, just as motifs do, repeat while the rest of the atmosphere sort of builds around it and creates something very musically intense, atmospherically intense, that varies from song to song. Of course, there are some tracks here that are a little more mellow or laid back in terms of actual emotional intensity, but no matter what, there isn't a track here that doesn't sink its teeth into you in terms of brutality. This ultimately results in the seemingly tearing down of normalcy throughout Closer. Ultimately, Joy Division end up replacing any kind of normal music that could be presented here to a more casual listener as what could best be described as serene depression. It's so difficult to really capture with words. The most confusing part about it all, however, is that for the most part at least, Closer is a very mellow album. You could just as easily overanalyze this as I'm doing now as you could use it for background music while you're, I don't know, studying or doing the dishes or something like that. You might shed a tear, sure, especially if you know the history of the record, but it's still a fact that this is a very easily listenable album in terms of casual listens. As oxymoronic as it is, the main appeal of accessibility about Closer is the fact that it isn't necessarily accessible, while also not really experimental and not really diving into the incredibly experimental side of the genre of post-punk. Generally speaking, Closer is a decaying album, and it's all the more beautiful but painful for it. The instrumentation itself is interesting here as well, as it does explore industrial themes slightly more than its sister album did, Unknown Pleasures, and I'm kind of glad that it does. This especially shines in Stephen Morris's tense but calculated drumming, as well as Peter Hook's very kind of stiff, but purposefully stiff to the point that it's very catchy and memorable bass lines that really create a feeling of alienation between the band and the listener. Every clashing note and drum beat makes for a listen that is both as absolutely raw as it is mathematical. It's such a very odd listen to truly focus yourself on because everything about it instrumentally makes no sense and shouldn't work, but also completely makes sense. Now, above all else, Joy Division was Ian Curtis's vessel to express his hatred for different things, for his difficulty with accepting humanity, and most of all for his struggles with mental illness. With that being said, there's no denying that Bernard Sumner, Stephen Morris, and Peter Hook were nearly as essential in creating Joy Division's iconic sound. Overall, Closer doesn't have as many t-shirts for it as Unknown Pleasures does, though still quite a good many. And it doesn't have any really iconic songs like Disorder, or She's Lost Control, or the single Love Will Tear Us Apart. What it does have, however, is the documentation of a man's self-destruction and his demise, and what could also ultimately be seen as the ending of his life. As you may guess, it makes it a fairly difficult album to listen to, especially when you're really further analyzing it, but at the same time, it can be so easy to listen to as well. It's just thematically a very difficult album to tackle. After Curtis's death in this album, Sumner, Morris, and Hook would go on to form the admittedly great but extremely different New Order. However, nothing will ever match up to the utterly apocalyptic existentialism that was presented on both Unknown Pleasures and Closer, which is why I'm going to give Closer 4.5 stars out of 5. If it didn't make it so hard to revisit from a critical standpoint, I may actually give it a 5, but this is a difficult album to listen to, especially while you're reading about the history of it. It's not exactly the most joyful album, shall we say, but of course, music isn't meant to be nothing but joy. Music is meant to represent the artist or what the artist thinks should be done with the music, and, well, if there's something that represents a man who was struggling in so many ways, this is it. So, yeah. 4.5 stars out of 5. An incredibly brutal album by an incredibly brutal band, and I highly recommend listening to it. But with that being said, this is the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.